So, welcome back, and today we are going to be having a look at some previews for Silmarillion Total War. It's worth saying that this isn't going to be any gameplay, because while the submod has, to be quite frank, made some very good progress in a very short amount of time, there is still no gameplay that is actually in a playable state at the moment. But I would say that their fast progress can of course be chalked up to the fact they're not starting completely from scratch, so that is a very big boon for them. It means that they're able to get down to the business of actually creating the things like the units and the mechanics right away, rather than having to mess around with some of the very basics like you had to do for the initial Third Age, and of course even Reforged and DAC have had to go through that as well. But Silmarillion is making very good progress with all of these sources to draw their inspiration from. But what I can do is I can talk about some of the mechanics that I know are going to be implemented into the game, some of the design philosophies that are going into it, and also most of this video, to be fair, will probably be spent on looking at some of the stills for the units which are going to be implemented into the game, and speculating on what they may bring to the table for their factions. Of course, this is nowhere near the full roster. Silmarillion Total War is bound to have a smaller lineup of factions than something like Reforged. Obviously, Reforged has had a ton of development time, and they've got a lot of factions in the game. They're already pushing up against the limit for total units that they're allowed in the game. Silmarillion will not have that many factions, of course, but you know there will still be a decent amount in there for you to choose from, and they're not completely done on them yet, far from it, but they are making good progress nonetheless. But I think where we will start off is talking a little bit about the mechanics. Now, it's worth saying before I go into this that I will be sharing a few things I know about what they're thinking of in the direction they're thinking of going in for Silmarillion Total War, but I will not be going into great detail about what I know, purely because people tend to have this really antagonizing way of thinking where they will immediately sort of latch on to one thing that I say and immediately then sort of pour bile all over the place and just want to be negative about things. And I really don't want to do that to the developers here. I really don't want to just sort of say something and then have people sort of angrily pointing fingers at them. They shouldn't, because everything I've heard so far has been good ideas. But if I were to, for example, just say such and such a unit will not be as powerful as in Reforged, all of a sudden there'll be people throwing their arms up into the air and going, oh well, that's rubbish, you know, they should change this, I won't play this, that sounds like crap, I'm going to do something different. Which is why I'm only going to be talking about things in a very general sense. Everything is subject to change anyway, so it doesn't really make a good deal of sense to me to go into great details. But please don't just go into the comment section looking for a fight with the developers, because I won't be happy with it, they won't be happy with it. All you'll do is make everyone pissed off. So don't do that, because I've had my fill of that in the past, and I don't want it to happen again here when they, J-Monster specifically asked me to do a preview for Silmarillion Total War, and I want to do it, and I don't want it to turn into that. So we'll be having a look at some of the units later, which hopefully will be something which everyone can universally enjoy. As for the mechanics, the main thing that I would say differentiates it from Reforged is the power curve. The power curve in Reforged is quite extreme, I would say. Obviously, it's not as extreme as it once was, where the elite units were just absolute monsters that would just mow through everything they touched. But there is still a sense in Reforged that there are certain units at the high end that are extremely powerful. You know, Witches would be one good example of that, but even stuff like the Black Engineers, for example, other stuff like that, the sort of universal presence of javelins and rangers and crossbows, a lot of damage at range in particular in Reforged at the high end with some of those specialty projectiles. And that is going to be very different in Silmarillion Total War. Silmarillion Total War is going to go for a much more grounded approach, I would suggest. And what I mean by that is each faction will probably have 2, possibly 3 sort of high-end showstopper units, as it were. Whereas in Reforged you can have like rangers, and you can have several units of multiple HP bodyguards that you can pick from. You can't field them all, but you can still pick from them. That will not be the case in Silmarillion Total War. For example, I do know that at the moment there's only one body-piercing archer that has been implemented into the game. So while rangers are an extreme presence in Reforged, that is unlikely to be the case in Silmarillion. Which means that if you do have them, great, you can still use them to very good effect, but no longer will the game have to rely on taking into account the fact that most everyone has access to this kind of tool. So it'll be interesting to see how that affects things. Obviously, with certain factions having access to some very high-ticket tools that other factions don't, I'm interested to see how that will be balanced. Obviously, body-piercing archers, if you do have that, that immediately puts you in a very good position going forward into a siege in particular. but perhaps they don't have access to certain other things. I believe it's the Green Elves that have got access to the one body piercing archer at the moment, and maybe like another one or maybe two added later. But for the time being, that is the only planned archer of such a type, and I would imagine that's fairly similar across the board. So each faction, will probably have a couple of things about them that they're really good at, but then they may have more noticeable gaps. It's also likely as well that with the less extreme units at the really high end, that this will make the battles a little bit more, again, grounded would probably be the best way to describe it, I suppose. And that's again, a very general overview of what sort of design I think they're going for here. It is worth saying as well that some of the battles in this era, one thing that I do know about the first age of this is that some of the battles were absolutely massive. So I'd be interested to see how they are going to try and capture that kind of scale, because obviously there's only so much you can do with Medieval 2, because there's only so many armies you can field, there's only so big you can make the units, for example. But I'm still going to be interested to see how they take this more grounded approach with their factions and manage to keep that epic scale that the first age did have. But I think with that in mind, just letting you know that, so I suppose that also, in comparison to DAC, obviously DAC is a very different game. I would not, if you're going into this expecting to see DAC but in a different age, I think you should probably stop thinking in those terms, because the thing about DAC is it's fantastic as a single player game. It's not so great as a multiplayer game because the balance is not tooled for that at all. The hope with Silmarillion, I think, is to try and marry some of the best elements of the two into a single game. But we'll see how successful they are at that, because obviously Reforged and DAC are at completely opposite ends of the spectrum when it comes to actually balancing the mechanics of the game. So I'd be interested to see how Silmarillion takes on some of the lessons learned from both of those submods and tries to implement it in this one. But obviously the fact playing it in multiplayer and having it be a balanced affair is obviously going to be important, but I feel as though maybe lore considerations are going to be coming into things a little bit more so here in Silmarillion than they often do in Reforged, which will probably make some people happy, but of course that is going to be a challenge for the developers to try and overcome as well. But I think with that, we shall move on to some of the units. I've tried to divide them up into factions, but as I've said, I'm not really all that knowledgeable about the first age of Total War. I've not read the Silmarillion. I don't really know much about it. All things considered. Certainly not as much as I do about the timeline around the start of the movie trilogy, and that's really where my knowledge lies. I'm not really all that clued up on this. So I think I've got everyone in their correct factions at the moment, of which I think I have 5, which I can showcase a few things of, some with more in them than others. But I'm sure the developers will let me know that I've misplaced a couple of them. But for the most part, I think I'm okay. But we'll start off with having a look at the Sons of Feanor. So the Sons of Feanor will be made up by primarily elves, but they will also have a human contingent to them also to supplement their ranks. And it seems as though they will generally be having a red colour scheme. I think as well, most of their influence from Reforged factions, for example, most of their visual influence will be coming from Imladris and from Linden, so a lot of high elven look going on here. Starting off here, we have the Defenders of Aglon, and having a look at them, they do seem to have their chain. They don't look overly armoured, to be quite frank. They've just got those long swords that they use, so they are going to be shock infantry. And obviously, I would assume as well that for the most part, a lot of the mechanics will be staying similar with regards to the weapon types and so on and so forth. There are certain things that you can infer from Medieval 2's mechanics, after all, which are just set in stone. So I would imagine here that this is going to be a non-AP unit with very high base damage, high charge, that sort of thing. Doesn't look like they'd be overly durable over a longer period of time, obviously being without a shield. Their armour doesn't look overly thick. But of course, as with most Elven units, I would imagine, as we have grown accustomed to, as soon as they get into melee, that is going to be where they are most at home. And as if that wasn't enough, we also have an armour upgrade for them here, which does make them look significantly more tanky. Although, as we know, armour upgrades, they are good for boosting your survivability, but perhaps, not to the extent that this armour would have you suggest. So that would obviously be a bump of 2. But this should still make them significantly tankier. I do love the look as well. Obviously, anyone who likes the look of Imladris is obviously going to like this faction a lot, because it does look as though a lot of their influences have come from Imladris, obviously with those helmets that were reserved for the High Elven Knights previously. Very nice swords as well. Now we have the first of a few of the human units that the Sons of Feanor can field. We have the Hellevang Rangers, or the Rangers of Hellevang. It is worth saying as well that, as I said, body piercing, the word Ranger in the title will no longer denote immediately the fact that they're a body piercing archer, because these are not. They are javelin men that will then also pull out a weapon in melee, so a decent sort of auxiliary hybrid troop here, and I'd imagine that that is what the human units in the Sons of Feanor will be. They will be there to try and support the elves and sort of deliver them to the enemy, in many ways sort of like a reverse Dorwinian, whereas, in Reforged, obviously with Dorwinian you have the heavily armoured human units which are on the front, sort of front and centre, and then the elves will be sort of supporting them and trying to do the damage for them. Here I think it's going to be quite a similar relationship that they have, but in a very different way. So the elves will obviously be much more accomplished in melee, again being the damage dealers, but being those elite troops as well, whereas the humans will be trying to sort of prop them up with their numbers and trying to make sure that they're properly supported. And with javelins there, you can also see that he wields a sort of sword and shield in melee, so that should be very good indeed to support a strong elven infantry line. And then moving on, we have the Hellevang Shieldbearers, which are a fully melee focused unit. They are what looks to be a heavy spearman, almost akin to what you would sort of expect from the dismounted Royal Guard from Rohan, or the Westmark Spears as they're now called. Almost as well, based on the colour scheme and based on the equipment, it's almost, as it should be I suppose, look like the progenitors to factions like Rohan and Rudauer. So I would imagine that you can probably look at the Westmark Spears to give an example of what this sort of unit will be good at. Front and centre, really helping with their numbers alongside the elves, and then obviously their spears, being able to get into formation, helping against cavalry. Their armour values are probably not going to be all that high. Most of the Northmen factions, even by the 3rd and 4th ages, didn't seem to have the armour thing as well down as many of the others. So I'd imagine that is going to be the case here, where if you really want the elite, you're going to have to lean more heavily into the elves, but the support of these humans is going to be a big boon, because obviously it means you won't be fully reliant on quality. You'll be able to have a bit of quantity as well. And I do like the helms as well. I like the colour scheme. It's sort of like a red Rohan, which is nice. And now we have the Knights of Maglor. Now, this is a unit which perhaps is not given justice here, because this would be a unit that would be on horseback, of course. They would be knights, so this is obviously going to be one of these so-called showstopper units, as I said in the intro for the Sons of Feanor. They will obviously have access to a fantastic unit of heavy cavalry, which they can charge around the battlefield and really try to seize control of the map with it. Obviously, in terms of a unit that you can look to compare them to, I would imagine they're going to be quite similar to the Gwythi Rockdor from Reforged. They have the same sort of shields after all. They have a rather different looking set of weaponry, I suppose. They've got a sort of like a wooden lance, and they've got that nice elven sword that they also use as well. The red colour scheme. So yeah, I'd imagine that this is going to be quite straightforward with regards to what they are going to offer, the Sons of Feanor, but still, it's always nice to have a unit of really strong, heavy cavalry so that you can really put your opponent under pressure on the mobility side of things. And then the equivalent on foot, we have the Maglor Bodyguard. So this is going to be obviously the variant that's on foot, a sword and shield heavy infantry unit. So interestingly enough, I'm not really sure what to compare this to from Reforged, because most of the Elven Bodyguards in Reforged actually are not sword and board units. But perhaps you could view them as sort of like a multiple HP Noldorin Guard. And one thing that you can also note here is the face textures are actually of pretty good quality. And this is because there is a sort of more of an emphasis on quality, I think, in Silmarillion Total War. They really want to use sort of high quality assets all around to really try and squeeze that last bit of potential out of Medieval 2. Sort of try and make it as good as they possibly can, which is a very noble endeavour indeed. But again, another very nice unit. So again, that very heavy Imladris influence that they've got in their style. It's probably better to say it's the other way around, to be fair, because obviously this is before the events of the Third Age, but I'm just going to be referring to it as the way around that I have been, just because it's easier for me to keep track of everything if I do it that way. But yeah, I would imagine, obviously, again, this is going to showcase the Sons of Feanor's strengths. So obviously they have these very elite, strong units that they can really depend upon, and then they can support those units with lots of other humans and sort of even their basic elves around them as well. And the focus of their bodyguard units seem to suggest that as well. Another unit of cavalry that they have as well are the mounted Aglon Lancers. So again, there is a very Imladris-y sort of feel to this, Imladris plus some of the humans as well, because obviously this would be a unit that you would imagine would be quite similar to the Eldarenway Lancers from Reforged. So again, they even have pretty much the same unit model, only it has been tinted red. They've been given a brand new shield with the correct heraldry on it. They obviously have their lances and their melee weapons as well. So as Lancers, I would imagine that the cavalry the way that the cavalry works is going to be laid out in a similar manner to Reforged, where you have your lancers, which are designed for charging into enemy infantry blobs or even other mounted units, but getting out quickly and cycle charging around. And then you have your melee cavalry, which is obviously the complete opposite. They charge in to other cavalry and stay there. And then spear cav, which is kind of in the middle. So just based on their name, you'd have to say the lancers would be very much the damage dealers here. In support of the knights as well, I would imagine that would give the Sons of Fëanor a very deadly cavalry force in. This, again, is another unit that denotes the red coloration that the Sons of Fëanor have, as well as their heraldry. We have the Mounted Company of Heimring, and this looks like javelin cavalry to me. So they obviously have their javelins, so again, more of that high elven influence. Obviously, this is the sort of thing that Lyndon traffics in Reforged, and obviously this will give them even more strength on horseback, because one of the things that you can really make work for you on horseback are going to be those javelins, because in a cab-to-cab engagement, if you're getting showered with javelins by the opposing side, it just makes it that much more likely that you're going to come out of the cab fight on the losing end of it. You know, javelins are very, very powerful, of course. I'd be interested to see how powerful and how present javelins are in Silmarillion Total War. I kind of hope that javelins are not the all-encompassing presence that they are in Reforged, because I do feel as though the javelins have gotten a little bit out of hand in Reforged. Everyone has the javelins because everyone needs them based on the way the game works. If they don't, certain units like knights just run roughshod all over you. But even so, it does look as though, you know, the Sons of Fëanor are going to be very much based around their mounted units and then sort of using their infantry. It's going to be, yeah, like a sort of a mishmash, I suppose, of Imladris, Lyndon and Rohan is what I would say the Sons of Fëanor are shaping up to be based on what I'm seeing of them here. And then a unit which is, again, something which is very reminiscent of something from Imladris. We have the Riders of Aglon, which are a bow cavalry, melee cavalry hybrid by the looks of things. They of course have that sword and shield they pull out. They've also got that quiver on their back for their bows. That should be something which is very similar to the Riders of the Bruin in Reforged. And again, I'm going to keep sort of comparing it to Reforged because that's my point of reference here. And this, again, it just goes to show that I do feel as though the Sons of Fëanor will be leaning very heavily on their cavalry just based on the kind of strengths they seem to have. They seem to have a lot of units which cover most of their bases. They've got lancers, they've got hybrid cavalry, they've got knights as well, which again, there's a very high chance that not just any old faction is going to have access to knights. So just having those is going to be a big deal, and then being able to support it with all these other units is going to be very good. And of course, Elven Archers as well, going to be able to deal that damage. I think Archers are going to be made a little bit stronger as well, based on what I've heard for Silmarillion. I think the range on them just across the board is going to be bumped up just a little bit. It's probably not going to be a super big difference, but it is going to make them just that little bit more important, especially when it comes to the Elves, of course, because we know how good Elven Archers can be. Now, this is probably the one that I'm least sure about, but this is right on the border of this and the next faction, I think. So, the only sort of file name that was a part of these guys were the upgraded Sons of Fëanor bows, but based on their colour scheme, I'm almost tempted to say that that's not the faction they belong to, although they do have that sort of high elven style, which maybe means they are, but they may also be part of the House of Fingolfin. I'm not sure. Maybe it was just something that was wrong in the Discord when I downloaded it, and they meant to say it's on a different side, because obviously, for the most part, you colour code your faction, and this is very clearly showing blue heraldry on it, but nonetheless, this is kind of like a sort of combination of the Noldorin and the... what are they called? I've completely forgotten their name. I've blanked on them entirely, but the Imladris Archers, the Noratirno, that's it. The Noratirno and the Noldorin, almost like a combination of those two kinds of units. Obviously, again, you know, it's kind of difficult to speak because obviously I don't have any numbers in front of me for how these units are going to perform, so I'm kind of having to sort of guess at what they're going to be good at. Obviously, very heavily armoured archers, these guys, upgraded as well. Overall, probably going to be very strong. I'm not sure how strong they'll be in melee because, you know, they only have that single one-handed sword and no shield. So overall, it's probably going to be something along the lines of just sort of a standard heavy elven archer, I would imagine, when you upgrade their armour. And then another unit I'm fairly sure that are part of the Sons of Fëanor, because obviously they have that human contingent to them. We have the Argalion Stalkers, which again are a sort of javelin infantry hybrid, which does maybe suggest that they are a part of another faction, but I wasn't sure where to put them. Obviously they pull out their axe in melee with that shield, they throw their javelins as well, so they're probably going to be quite similar to the javelin hybrid unit for the humans that we saw previously. However, they do still have that sort of Northman aesthetic, a very sort of basic set of armour as well. So again, very much a supporting unit and not a showstopper in itself. But even so, I do like seeing all of these sort of like the progenitors for the styles which emerged in the Third Age. It's kind of interesting. And then I think the final unit that I've got to show for the Sons of Fëanor is another upgraded model, apparently, because again, the only thing that it said was the upgraded Sons of Fëanor Swordsman. So I'm not entirely convinced that they are from the Sons of Fëanor, again, because the colour scheme seems to have changed from red to blue. But again, this is obviously very similar to the heavily armoured Linden troops from Reforged. They seem to have a sort of more Imladris-y style helm, but other than that, obviously again very high elven in terms of their fashion. Obviously they're going to be a very strong unit of line infantry, I am sure. So now we move on to what I think is the House of Fingolfin, and it's worth saying as well that none of the other factions have got quite so many units in them so far as the Sons of Fëanor, so we will be seeing slightly less as we move forward. But here we have the Fingolfin Bladesmen, so they seem to have a blue colour scheme, which is why I'm fairly certain that maybe those two units we just saw that were sort of blue-clad elves were perhaps Fingolfin. But this is going to be the sort of the standard line infantry, I'd imagine, for this faction. So slightly less armoured overall by the looks of them than the Sons of Fëanor, so maybe they have a little bit more in common and lean a little bit more into Linden's way of thinking than Imladris's, whereas the Sons of Fëanor are maybe the other, sort of lean the other way. But even so, we all have good experience with Elven line infantry, and I'd imagine that's going to be the same here again. Lower numbers, but overall individual quality very strong. If you can't really affect the fight, they're going to be able to slowly mulch their way through the front line. But of course, with more elves sort of running around, you know, the First Age, generally speaking, there's going to be a bit more of a focus around these big elven armies sort of marching across the landscape. So maybe just being an elf is no longer going to be enough to sort of guarantee you a quality advantage, because there's going to be so many other elven factions you're going to have to consider fighting. But even so, you'd imagine that they're going to be a very solid pick for your front line. And then, just for that, we also have the Fingolfin Bowmen, or the Fingolfin Marksmen. Again, this is going to be sort of obviously very similar in terms of style, only they traded in their shield for a bow and some arrows. I'd imagine that in melee they're okay, but nothing too special. At range, they're probably going to be the bread and butter that the House of Fingolfin are able to field. So overall, you're probably going to be seeing quite a lot of this kind of unit. I'd be interested to see how the factions sort of line up against one another in terms of their relative strengths. Like, I'd imagine that the Sons of Fëanor that we saw are going to be a little bit more focused around their cavalry, and maybe some of their infantry is sort of propped up by the fact they can support it with more expendable human units. I'd be interested to see how House of Fingolfin shape up. Maybe they are a little bit more archery focused, you know, a little bit more focused around their units on foot. So maybe a little bit more of an infantry focus as well, but we shall see. Could be a good hybrid unit, or it could just be a standard elven archer, which even then, they're not half bad in melee. Then we have the Vinyamar Marines, which again, this is a very Linden-esque unit, and again, it's actually a unit which seems to be sort of you put like a sort of Imladris unit and a Linden unit in the Hadron Collider and smash them together, because this looks like a Noritano warrior collided with a 4 Linden Marine, and this is what the result was. They do have a sword, so to be fair, they aren't going to be having access to any sort of anti-cavalry bonus in melee at the very least. But obviously, you know, Javelin hybrid units like this are always going to be very useful. It's the sort of thing which Linden built most of their success on in 0.96 of Reforged. And I would imagine that it's based on the fact that we're seeing what Fingolfin are all about. Like, again, I have no idea what the lore of these various groups are. So it's possible that Fingolfin were the progenitors to the group that's in Linden. And that's why there's all of these similarities, including their colour scheme. But yeah, overall, this is going to be a very good supporting unit. Obviously, they just rely on elven hands rather than employing humans to be their javelin men for. And then we have the Spears, so that's kind of rounds off the base for the House of Fingolfin's main line. So we have the Wardens of Hithlum, which I think all of them are called Hithlum, like the Swordsmen of Hithlum, the Marksmen of Hithlum, and now it's the Wardens. So they're obviously going to be Spears. Kind of, I would assume this is going to be the equivalent of like the heavy elven spears from like Reforged, so they're going to be there sort of tying down presumably the flanks most of the time, but overall again there isn't a great deal of armour on these guys, so they're probably going to be a little bit more focused around melee defense, maybe a little bit more attack in melee as well, to make up for the fact that that lack of armour can be exploited. There are certain things, like I said, that you can sort of infer just from Medieval 2's mechanics. But yeah, interesting. I do feel as though Linden is probably the closest comparison to the House of Fingolfin that I can see. Now though, I think it's time that we got away from the Elves, at least for a time, and talk about the Orcs of Thangorodrim, and we start off with the Bulldogs. I'm not sure what they are, they might just be called the Bulldogs, I'm not sure. But you can see they're quite a grisly unit, because rather like the Blackwatch Legion in Reforged, they've got these sort of spikes which they sort of place heads on, but rather than the skulls that they are in the Blackwatch Legion, they are just straight up severed, rotting heads, which is rather grisly indeed. You can see that they're not like the Blackwatch Legion in terms of functionality, though. That is something else which I feel like I should quickly mention as well. Mass pushing units are not going to be a thing in Silmarillion Total War, I don't think. So that'll probably make quite a lot of people quite happy, to be honest with you. But they are not going to be a thing. So maps will have to be designed around the fact that you can't do that in Silmarillion, at least not without incurring a lot of losses. So we'll see how that works out. But the Bulldogs, I would imagine, are going to be sort of one of those higher-end bodyguard tier units that the Orcs of Thangorodrim can field, sort of on a similar vein to what the Bulldogs are in Reforged. To be fair, they are a Mordor bodyguard. I'd imagine that's the exact function they're going to be filling here as well. I like the fact they've got those sort of grisly trophies on their back. It really gives them a sense of personality. Obviously, quite a wicked blade that they carry as well. Thin shields, very much a sort of dark black colour scheme, which the Orcs are going to be sporting. In some way. Then we move on to some of the main line that the Orcs of Thangorodrim can field, and we start off with the Ironshot Halberds, and you can see from their model that they are based pretty heavily around the Mountain Uruk host that is in Reforged currently, so there's kind of like a Dol Guldur vibe going on with them. They've obviously been changed up a little bit, their colour scheme has been made darker, they've lost some elements of their armour, including most of their trousers and their arm guards, to be fair. So again, with the Orcs, I'm going to be interested to see how they fit into things, because obviously they're going to have to be very numbers heavy. You know, most of the other factions that are going to be rallying against them in Silmarillion are going to be made up of, you know, numerous Elven factions, you know, and it'll be interesting to see how the Orcs match up with them. But obviously Ironshot Halberds, in terms of functionality, we all know what Halberds do. They're going to get into a phalanx, it's armour piercing. As long as there aren't pikes around to outrange them, they could be a very good anchor for your line. But other than that, nothing too out of the ordinary. And then we have the basic equivalent as well in the Swordsmen. We have the Ironshot Swordsman. Again, pretty much the exact same unit model, only they have the thin shields as well. So again, very much a Dol Guldur-like aesthetic going on with them, only perhaps with a slightly spikier visor on their helmet. So they're going to be undoubtedly the standard main line infantry for the Orcs of Thangorodrim. So they're going to be getting butchered en masse by many Elven factions, I'm sure, when Silmarillion comes out. But even so, it's an ugly job, but someone's got to do it. And to be quite frank, they don't look as bad in terms of quality just from a visual perspective as some of the stuff like Heavy Goblin Infantry or even Moranon Infantry. They look pretty good, actually, all things considered, but obviously they're still going to be thoroughly outmatched, I'm sure, in most cases when it comes to quality. We'll see how many of them there are per unit, though. And then we have the Trolls, or at least one of the Troll units. I just got, you know, the file name that I got, it just referred to them as the Trolls. So this is going to, I think they're like troll officers, which are going to be sort of, obviously, as with any other trolls, they're going to be fantastic at sort of shocking the enemy lines, really doing a lot of damage quickly, busting through. You know, this is one area where you will be able to sort of mass push your way through. If the line is too thin, the trolls should be able to just push right through them, because that's just what they do. Obviously nice shields, pretty wicked looking blades as well. I'm interested to see how the Trolls will fare, because obviously the Trolls, you kind of know what you're going to get from them, but with the whole meta shifting around them, I will be interested to see how the Orcs can deploy their Trolls in Silmarillion, because they could be extremely important against a lot of the quality that many of the Elven factions they're going to be facing off against are going to be able to field. Very, very scary, but interestingly enough, not the scariest unit that I've got to show that the Orcs can call upon. Yep, he's back. It's the Balrog. I'll be interested to see if he can actually enter the game without crashing it now. Obviously, he was a thing way back in Vanilla Third Age, but he always crashed the game, so he was impossible to use. I hope that he will not prove to be such a burden when Silmarillion comes out. But the fact that, you know, they allowed me to show the Balrog suggests to me that they are going to be they're going to be putting a lot of focus on actually making him work, because there are several other units which I've seen screenshots of in the game, but I'm not showing them yet because I don't know if they will actually work. So the Balrog may not actually even be the most spectacular unit which is going to be added to Silmarillion, which I'm actually quite excited about. Units like this, they obviously give a real sense of scale to some of these battles which are going to be happening, and I look forward to seeing the Balrog in action. I really hope that it is something which can be made to work in a more stable sense than it ever was in Vanilla Third Age. But there he is, he's back, and let's hope that we can see him at his glorious best. So now we move on to the third and the final Elven faction that I've got to... Actually, no, it's not the final Elven faction, is it? No, never mind. So this is going to be the Green Elves, though, and they have a fair few units that I can show. So here we have the Archers of Durnan, and again, this is going to be sort of a standard baseline Elven Archer, I would imagine. Obviously, you've got those green colour schemes, and that's why I'm assuming they are the Green Elves, because of the green colour scheme. But I could be wrong, again, I'm not entirely sure of the naming, because obviously I've just taken these pictures from the Discord to show off, but obviously they just have, a lot of them just were posted up with saying this is this, rather than this is the faction they're in. There's no, definitive lists at the moment, because obviously people are just sort of developing these units in their little development groups, and yeah, so it may just be my ignorance, and again, I'm sure the developers can come in and correct me if I'm getting anything wrong, but the main point of this is just to show off some of the unit models anyway. So a basic Elven Archer, and they are going to be dual wielding in melee as well, so that should give them a lot of melee defense. But for the most part, they're obviously going to be more focused around their archery, and again, the Green Elves, I would imagine, archery is going to be their main thing, just because, they have the body-piercing archer that's in the game at the moment, so it would make a certain amount of sense. And then we have the Defenders of Durnan as well, so they are obviously going to be a spear unit. Again, not too much to say here. I'd imagine that, again, they're going to be sort of the equivalent of a mid to heavy Elven Spear. Not a terrible amount of armour on these guys, and I would imagine that the Green Elves, they probably will be lacking a little bit of armour as well, so it'll be interesting to see how they engage with. So Mirkwood and Lothlorien would be the ones that, you can obviously draw comparisons to for the Green Elves, I would imagine. So these Spearmen will be able to hold the line, but presumably attrition is not how this faction is probably going to want to go about doing their business. Something a little bit more impressive looking, however, are the Doriath Axemen, which I would suggest are going to be sort of the upper end of line infantry that this faction can field. Obviously an axe in one hand, a pretty impressive looking shield in the other, and armour which certainly looks more impressive than most of the units they're going to be fighting alongside. And they do have a similar sort of unit model to the upgraded Here units from Mirkwood, or even up to something like the Palace Guard, to be fair. Although I would certainly suggest that this unit would probably not be on the same sort of level as the Palace Guard, but still, it's always good to have a very good unit of line infantry on the front line, which can also do killing as well, which, those axes, again, I would assume that an axe is going to denote a little bit more of a focus around damage rather than defense, so it's always good to have a unit of damaging line infantry to help take the pressure off some of your other units to sort of do the damage, as it were. Most people, I think, just view line infantry as a meat shield, when that is not necessarily the case. Similar story here with the Doriath Shieldbearers as well, so this is going to be the heavy Elven Spear that the Green Elves can call upon. So once again, you can see it's like a sort of proto-Mirkwood that we've got going on here with those silvered scales that they have. Big shield, big spear, going to be very good at trying to hold down the front line. So a lot of spears so far that we're seeing across all the factions, really. A couple of them here for the Green Elves as well. So the Elves, spears are always going to have that malice, but I think the Elves can sort of get away with that more than anyone else because they've got higher melee defense and their stats in general are higher, so they can sort of absorb the malices a little bit easier, and it allows their spears to still be able to stand up very well over a long period of time against enemy. Then we have the Scouts of Tauren Faroth. Now this is going to be a pretty interesting looking hybrid unit because it looks as though they have a long spear and a bow and arrow. I would assume that that's a two-handed spear and not a pike. It'd be interesting if it were a pike, but it would also make them quite difficult to be used as sort of more mobile units because obviously, the phalanx formation is not really the easiest to use on a unit like this. Not impossible. The Proudfoot Protectors from Reforged do it, but I believe this would just mean that they're sort of more mobile archer unit, and if enemy cavalry does bear down upon them, they can defend themselves a little bit better with those spears. But yeah, definitely a rather interesting unit to add into the mix. It means that you can be a little bit more... You don't need to support them with spears or cavalry quite so much as you would with other archers, perhaps. Maybe that's the thing. And then we have the Stalkers of Tauren Faroth as well. So they are going to be another kind of unit which is more designed to sort of be that sort of hidden, that sort of crouching elf hidden archer kind of deal. Obviously go out to the far sides of the map, do some damage from the sides. They're also wielding 2 daggers in melee, and I believe that in order to make a unit like this a little bit more appealing, because dual wielding doesn't work too well in Medieval 2, because it does give you a lot of melee defense, but you can only attack with one weapon still. So it's kind of like having, it's kind of like having a shield that works in melee in a way. But shields just tend to do that job better because obviously they can block arrows, which is the main weakness to a unit like this. But in Silmarillion, I believe the idea is to make a unit like this armor piercing as well. So they may not be getting any extra attack from having those two weapons, but the armor piercing will give them a little bit more utility. And obviously, it'll be interesting to see how these Stalkers work. And then we have the Swordsmen of Tarath, Durnan, and they are, again, another very similar Linden-esque unit. They've got a very similar unit model as well. A swordsman that is also a javelin, so again, Mythalon Marines, sort of sent around the Hadron Collider, Megil Erin the other way. That's what I would imagine the situation is here. I mean, obviously javelins, does look as though javelins are still going to be a fairly big presence. I do hope that they're not quite the all-conquering force that stuff like Demons of the Desert are in Reforged, because I feel as though I like the idea of having a more grounded sort of Lord of the Rings submod, because, with Reforged, it has sort of fallen into pattern a little bit lately of whoever can use their high-ticket skirmisher wins the battle. I do hope that that isn't the case with Silmarillion, because this is the chance to do something a little bit new. But still, javelins, very useful for a faction like this, obviously, who wants to spread their wings and maybe just sort of support individual archers with a javelin unit like this so they can't be charged down. And then finally, we have a couple of units from what I believe is Gondolin. A couple of units, one of which everyone already knows about, at least anyone who's on the Discord. We have the House of the Pillar here, who of course are very nasty looking, almost like a Roman-esque helmet with that sort of the red tuft that comes off it. They've got the nice visor as well, nice shield, nice axe, big armor as well. Very nice looking unit overall, I have to say. I'll be interested to see how high tier this particular unit is, because based on the armor alone, it has the potential to be a General's Bodyguard tier unit, which would of course make it one of those 2 to 3 sort of uber tier units that a faction is allowed to have. And obviously with that axe they'll be able to deal a lot of damage as well. But if not, then they're obviously going to be a very high tier unit of line infantry regardless. And then finally, a bit of a work in progress. We have the House of the Wing, which are not fully done yet, but we can see the helmet model for them. So you can see the wings, you can see the eyes just poking through there. But obviously you can see here the designs that would morph into the Gondorian helmets in the future. Obviously, Gondolin going to be... I'm very interested to see what Gondolin look like as a faction when they're done. As obviously, you can just see from a unit like this that I think they're going to be right up my alley. Some really nice heavy armour that they're going to be sporting as well. Obviously, not too much to talk about here because I don't even know what the this House of the Wing unit is going to be. Based on the file name at the top there in milk shape, it says sword, so either a two-handed swordsman or a sword and board unit perhaps. Two-handed swordsman would maybe make a little bit more maybe be a little bit more exciting for a unit like this, and I would imagine that this is going to be a very high tier unit as well. So this is a thing that hasn't actually been posted up to the Discord yet, but I'm sure it will be momentarily after the video goes live. So a lot of very nice looking things that I can share with you here, to be sure. Like I said, there's actually a few more things that I could share as well, but I'm not going to at the moment because they are work in progress and some of them may not work. I do hope they do though, because it would be quite spectacular to see all of these things working in tandem. So it's equal parts more grounded, and yet also sort of there's going to be a few units which hopefully can be added to the game as well, which make it sort of even more fantasy, going into sort of the most epic things that Lord of the Rings had in those eras. Obviously we can't have the dragon that was the size of a mountain range because there's only so big Medieval 2 battles can get, but we can do something. It'll be interesting to see if all of those things work. But yeah, big thanks to the developers for sharing some of these things with. And that brings us really to the end of having a look at some of the units and a little chat about Silmarillion Total War. So again, this was kind of off the cuff. It's I would like to do something a little bit more involved with Silmarillion, but it's kind of difficult when obviously there's no gameplay available yet. All I can really do is talk about stills and talk about some of the things that I've spoken about to J Monster, who is obviously one of the lead developers. Obviously speaking about some of the mechanics and showing off some of the unit models is one thing, but I feel as though the next preview I do will be when there's actually something which I can show on the screen, because I feel as though a video like that flows a little bit better. This is all well and good, but I like sort of talking about something which is happening live in front of me. But nonetheless, I think I've seen enough from Silmarillion Total War to know that I am very much looking forward to it. I feel as though it's got a lot of potential. It's got a lot of potential to be something new as well. Like, it's not as if it's going to be doing the exact same thing that Reforged or DAC is doing. It's going to be doing something completely different, which I'm very much in favour of. I feel as though I'm ready for something new from the Lord of the Rings scene, and I feel as though this is a very good place to start with that. And at the very least, if the Netflix show ends up being a complete and unmitigated disaster, which I think it probably will end up being, like most things today, at the very least we'll have something like this to get our teeth into, and remember that Lord of the Rings is something that is very much worth celebrating. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this and found it somewhat informative. Again, there's only so much I can talk about without any sort of numbers or stats related to any of these units, and obviously I may not even have some of those units in the right faction, I'm not quite sure. But big thank you to the developers. Obviously, I think it's only the House of the Wing actually which I showed, which was completely new, like that can't have been shown before. But for most of you, like, this is probably the first time you're seeing some of these units, because, you know, obviously the Discord is there, but only a certain amount of people are on the Discord at the moment. But yeah, I greatly look forward to hearing more news from Silmarillion Total War. And the next video, it will be back to business as usual, and we'll be going back into another, I think, large-scale Third Age Reforged siege. So hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.